All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling some pretty heavy stuff. You've sent in some sources on the 12th century Indian philosopher and poet Śrīharṣa, so we're going to try to break all that down.
Yeah, sure. Definitely a fascinating figure. Really gets into the heart of what philosophy is all about, wouldn't you say?
I mean, I guess you could say that. At the core, it's this desire to understand, like, what is reality, right?
Absolutely. And that's precisely where Śrīharna comes in. His work, especially his masterpiece, what's it called? The Suites of Refutation.
Yeah, in Sanskrit, it's
Oh,
kantakatteja.
right, Kantanakadya.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful. But it's in that work where he really grapples with how solid our attempts to grasp reality through reason actually are.
Now, most people probably know Śrīharṣa because he's associated with Advaita Vedanta, a school of thought that really emphasizes the idea that the self or consciousness is the ultimate reality. It's like saying that everything we perceive as separate is actually just one big unified consciousness, which they call Brahman.
Exactly. And the Suites of Refutation is basically the main stage where he lays out his arguments. But here's the thing. Shahara isn't just trying to, build his own philosophical system. His main goal is to show how shaky rational inquiry itself is when it comes to, well, philosophy.
So he's saying no matter how logically sound your argument is, there's always going to be a counter-argument that's just as convincing.
Precisely. And, that kind of throws a wrench in the whole idea that logic alone can get us to absolute truth. He's making a statement about what reason can do, but more importantly, what it can't do when we're trying to understand, the big picture.
Right, so he's not just being difficult for the sake of it. There's a deeper point there.
For sure. And to make his case, he zeroes in on what's called the method of definition. This was like a big deal for the Nyaya school of thought. You could think of these Nyaya thinkers as the super organized librarians of ancient Indian knowledge, trying to categorize everything.
So, like, what are the fundamental parts of reality? How do we gain knowledge? How does logic work? All that good stuff.
Exactly. And their main goal, as your sources probably mentioned, was to establish a dualistic view of reality. They wanted to show that the world isn't just one big consciousness, but is made up of loads of separate things. Material objects, their properties, all distinct from that core consciousness.
Okay, so they're saying there's a clear division between the material world and consciousness.
Right. And Shirha comes in and says, hold on a second. What if you can't even define those basic categories that your whole system relies on?
That's got to be a problem.
It is. He's trying to show that any attempt to really nail down those essential categories falls apart. And if you don't have solid definitions for the building blocks of your philosophy, well, the whole thing starts to crumble, doesn't it?
It's like building a house on sand.
Exactly. And even though people argue about how strongly Śrīharṣa was connected to Advaita Vedanta, his attack on rational inquiry, especially this method of definition, has implications for, well, every philosopher.
Even today, right?
Right.
When we try to define things like knowledge or causation, we run into these same issues he was talking about centuries ago.
Absolutely. This isn't just some ancient history lesson. It makes us think critically about relying solely on reason and definitions to uncover the truth about reality. It's a challenge to how we do philosophy, period.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into this whole attack on definition thing. How did the Nyaya school typically go about defining philosophical concepts?
They had a pretty clear three-step process. First, there's enumeration, where they basically list out the things they want to talk about, like different sources of knowledge or types of reality.
Okay, so they lay out the groundwork first. Makes sense.
Right. Then comes definition, or lakkhana. They'd try to create a really precise definition, like a set of conditions that perfectly capture the essence of what they're trying to define. It's like drawing a line around a concept and saying, this is it, nothing else.
So, like, defining substance as something that has qualities. They're trying to get at the core of what makes a substance a substance.
Exactly. And finally, they'd move on to examination, or parikhan, where they really scrutinize their definition. Does it cover everything it should? Does it leave anything out? Is it clear and not circular? They were pretty meticulous.
It sounds like they were really trying to be as precise as possible.
Oh, they were. And especially when the Nyaya school combined with the Vaisika school, which had a very detailed view of reality, this method of definition became central to their whole philosophy. They were trying to describe everything precisely, from how we know things to the basic categories of existence.
Ambitious.
Definitely. And as we talked about earlier, they saw two main goals for definitions. One is to really specify what's being defined, so distinguish it from things that are similar but not the same, and also things that are totally different.
Like if you define water as a liquid that's tasteless, odorless, and transparent, you're setting it apart from milk or oil, but also from, a rock.
Exactly. And the second goal, especially emphasized by later Naya thinkers like Udayana, was to establish how we use a word. So you're laying out the conditions for when it's appropriate to apply a certain word or concept.
So like if you define knowledge as justified true belief, you're explaining why we use the word knowledge for certain beliefs because they have those specific qualities.
Exactly. And these two goals are super important because Śrīharṣa's refutation arguments, the Kanchana Yukti, directly target how well Nyayavashika definitions achieve those goals. He's trying to prove that if you can't define those basic categories properly, you can't really distinguish them in any meaningful way.
And that throws a big wrench in their whole system, right? If you can't even pin down what you're talking about, how can you build a whole philosophy on top of it?
It's a major problem. Now, Śrīharṣa suggested two main ways his critiques were relevant. Firstly, he argued that because these definitions were shaky, our understanding of the world as being made up of lots of separate things might be wrong. If we can't even clearly define the differences between things, maybe those differences aren't really real. And this, he thought, could lend support to Advaita Vedanta, the idea of a single ultimate reality. He used the term indeterminable anirvakanya to describe this perceived plurality.
So if we can't define difference itself, maybe the differences we see in the world aren't as fundamental as we think they are.
Right. But Śrīharṣa also said something really interesting. He argued that even philosophers who weren't on board with non-dualism could benefit from his ideas. By really examining their definitions, they could either improve their views or admit that their core concepts are hard to define. He saw his method as a way to push philosophy to be more rigorous and self-aware, not just tearing things down.
So he's saying, hey, even if you disagree with me, this kind of critical thinking will help you sharpen your own arguments.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier that Śrīharṣa had three criteria for judging a definition. Those are super important for understanding his critique, so let's break those down a bit.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
The first one is extensional adequacy. That's a fancy way of saying that a definition needs to include all the things it should and exclude all the things it shouldn't. It has to fit the concept perfectly.
Like the definition of bachelor should include all bachelors and only bachelors. No married guys, no kids, right?
Exactly. Next, there's non-circularity. A definition shouldn't use the term itself or any closely related terms that you'd need to understand the original term to understand. It needs to provide a genuinely new way of understanding the concept.
So like defining virtue as a virtuous quality wouldn't be very helpful. It's just going in circles.
Right. And finally, there's uniformity. This one's a bit more subtle. Shura thought a good definition should identify a single unifying property that's present in all the things being defined. It shouldn't just be a list of different things that could qualify. He thought there should be a common essence that ties them all together.
Okay, so like a definition of game that just lists a bunch of different types of games without saying what they all have in common, that wouldn't cut it for Shura.
Precisely. He believed that without this unifying element, you're not really capturing the true nature of the concept. And those last two criteria, non-circularity and uniformity, tie back to the two goals of definitions we talked about earlier. Non-circularity is about providing a truly informative explanation, while uniformity is more about explaining why we consistently use a word for a certain group of things.
Okay, so that gives us a framework for understanding Śrīharṣa's critiques.
Yeah.
Now let's get into the specifics. He starts with epistemology, the study of knowledge. He really goes after attempts to define knowledge.
He does, and I think you, as a philosopher, will find his arguments here particularly interesting. He starts with a definition of knowledge offered by Udayana. Knowledge is non-mnemonic awareness of the truth. Basically, it's being aware of something true, but not just because you remember it.
Makes sense. You got to actually believe something that's true, not just recall it from memory.
Right. But Śrīharṣa immediately brings up a problem. What about accidentally true awareness, or kakataliya samvada? He uses some great examples to illustrate this.
Okay, let's hear them.
Well, imagine a gambler who just happens to guess the right number of shells in someone's hand, or someone who sees what they think is smoke on a hill, and they figure there must be a fire because of the smoke. But it turns out they were wrong about the smoke. It was just mist or something. But there actually is a fire on the hill just by chance. Or think about someone who wrongly believes that only cows have horns, and then they see a cow with horns and correctly identify it as a cow.
So in each case, they end up with a true belief, but it feels wrong to say they actually know it. They just got lucky. This reminds me of Gettier cases in modern philosophy, where you have a belief that's both true and justified, but still doesn't feel like knowledge because there's too much luck involved.
And that's the amazing thing. Śrīharṣa was writing about this problem centuries before Gettier. He was already pointing out that just having a true belief, even if you have some justification for it, isn't always enough for knowledge. There's something more to it than just being right by chance. This really challenges any definition of knowledge that doesn't account for this problem of epistemic luck.
Definitely makes you think twice about what it means to know something. So how did philosophers try to fix this definition of knowledge?
Well, they tried a bunch of things. One approach was to focus on the reliability of the method used to acquire the belief. So the revised definition might be something like, knowledge is true, non-recollective awareness produced by a method that always results in true beliefs.
So the idea is that in those lucky cases, the way the person arrived at their belief wasn't reliable. They could have just as easily been wrong. So real knowledge requires a more trustworthy method, one that doesn't lead to false beliefs.
Exactly. But Śrīharṣa had a response to this too. He introduced what he called the sufficiency principle.
Okay, what's that?
Basically, he said that if you have a true non-recollective belief, then the very conditions that caused that belief must have been sufficient to guarantee a true belief. In other words, given those specific circumstances, a false belief couldn't have happened.
So even in those lucky situations, the conditions led to a true belief, even if the method itself wasn't generally reliable.
Exactly. And while you can definitely argue about the sufficiency principle itself, Śrīharṣa's broader point is that even if you come up with super strict criteria for a reliable method, there's always a way to imagine a scenario where that method still produces a true belief purely by chance. It's really hard to get rid of this epistemic luck problem completely.
It's a tricky one, for sure. What else did they try?
Another idea was to define knowledge as true, non-recollective awareness produced by a method that's not defective. So methods that are flawed or unreliable wouldn't count.
Again, that seems to make sense intuitively. You wouldn't expect a faulty method to give you true knowledge.
Right. But Śrīharṣa immediately points out a problem. How do you define defective? If you say a defective method is one that can lead to false beliefs, well, now you're using the idea of false, the opposite of truth, to define knowledge. And that's circular, because truth is already part of the definition of knowledge. So to avoid this, you'd need to define defective in a way that has nothing to do with truth or knowledge. And sure, I was skeptical that this was possible.
So it's like trying to define up without using the word down.
Exactly. It highlights a fundamental challenge in trying to reduce knowledge to something else. You always seem to end up back where you started.
So what other definitions did they come up with?
Well, they also considered the idea of proper circumscription, or samyak parachiti. That's the idea that knowledge is being aware of an object, but also being aware of its distinctive mark, what makes it different from everything else. This definition is attributed to Udayana and Bazirvanya.
So it's not enough to just see a cow. You have to also recognize the specific features that make it a cow, and not, say, a horse.
Right. This was supposed to address the problems with lucky guesses and flimsy justifications.
Sounds promising. But I'm guessing Śrīharṣa had something to say about this too.
Oh, he did. He argued that this definition doesn't meet the criterion of uniformity. Basically, he said that the distinctive mark that supposedly characterizes knowledge is going to be different for every single case of knowledge. The things that make, a clod of dirt is dirt are going to be different from the things that make, a particular cow is that cow. There's no one thing that makes something a distinctive mark across all cases of knowledge.
So he's saying there's no single unifying feature that explains how we recognize the right distinctive mark in every situation.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he used a thought experiment involving two people named Uma and Una. They both hear the same statement, something like, "There are 5 fruits on that tree." They both hear it from different people, though. Una hears it from someone named Castor, who is known for always telling the truth. Uma hears it from Pollux, who's kind of a liar. Now, intuitively, we'd say that only Una knows there are 5 fruits on the tree, even though Uma has the same true belief. Śrīharṣa's point is that the distinctive mark, in this case, the thing that supposedly makes Una's belief knowledge, is really hard to pin down in a way that applies to every case of knowledge.
So he's pointing out that factors outside of the person's mind, like the reliability of the person who told them something, seem to matter for knowledge. But it's tough to fit that into a definition that's just about what's going on in the person's head.
Exactly. This connects to a big debate in modern philosophy about internalism versus externalism. Śrīharṣa was already wrestling with these issues centuries ago.
Wow, he was way ahead of his time. So is there anything else they tried?
Well, some philosophers propose the idea that knowledge is simply a basic, unanalyzable property of the world, like knowledgehood. Think of it like waterhood being the fundamental nature of water, which is what makes all HO molecules water.
So they're saying, let's just accept that knowledge is a basic thing, something we can't break down into smaller parts.
Right. They argued that our intuitions about what counts as knowledge are just us recognizing this knowledgehood in different beliefs. This approach tries to sidestep all of Śrīharṣa's objections by saying that knowledge just it's not made up of other things.
That's a clever move. Did it work?
Not for Śrīharṣa. He said, okay, even if knowledgehood exists, how do we know when it's present in a particular belief? We can't just look inside our minds and see it directly. We'd probably need to rely on those same problematic definitions of knowledge that we've been talking about. So appealing to knowledgehood doesn't really solve the problem. It just pushes it back a step.
So he's basically saying, you can't just declare something a basic property and call it a day. You still need to explain how we identify it.
Exactly. And he thinks those explanations will inevitably lead back to the same difficulties he's already exposed.
All right, so Śrīharṣa really tears apart all these attempts to define knowledge. He shows how epistemic luck, circularity, the need for uniformity, and the problem with treating knowledge as a basic property, all of these things make it really hard to come up with a satisfying definition.
He does. And his skepticism doesn't end with epistemology. He also questions even more fundamental concepts like causation and distinctness, which are central to the Nayavaishika view of reality.
Let's talk about causation first. This has been a headache for philosophers for, well, forever. How did Indian philosophers, especially those in the Nyaya school, understand causation back then?
They had a pretty broad understanding of it. It wasn't just about events, like one billiard ball hitting another. They thought things in general could be causes substances, qualities, actions, even events. So like when an axe chops down a tree, they wouldn't just focus on the moment the axe hits the tree. They'd also consider the axe itself, the person swinging it, the force of the swing, all sorts of things.
So it's a more holistic view of causation.
Right. And Śrīharṣa argues that defining what a cause actually is proves to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. He takes aim at a definition put forward by Udayana, causation as invariable conjunction. Basically, the effect is always preceded by the cause.
Seems straightforward enough, but I'm guessing there's a catch.
There is. Śrīharṣa points out that the word invariable can be interpreted in different ways, and each interpretation leads to problems. One way to understand invariable is to say that the cause is unconditionally present before the effect. So the cause always comes first, no matter what.
But that runs into the problem of, like, correlations that don't actually mean causation.
Right. Think about the early symptoms of a disease. They always come before the later, more serious symptoms. But we wouldn't say the early symptoms cause the later ones. They're both just effects of the same underlying disease.
Good point. So unconditional precedence isn't enough for real causation.
Right. Another way to understand invariable is to say that the cause is necessary for the effect. So the effect can't happen without the cause.
Okay, that seems more promising.
But that leads to the problem of irrelevance.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that might be necessary for an effect to happen, but we wouldn't say they're the cause. Like the color of the threads used to make a piece of cloth is necessary for that cloth to have that specific color. But we wouldn't say the color of the threads caused the cloth to exist. The weaving process caused the cloth to exist.
Right, so just because something has to be there doesn't mean it's the actual cause.
Exactly. To try and fix these problems, Udayana and others added a new condition to the definition, non-superfluity. That means the cause isn't something that exists independently of the effect.
Okay, so they're trying to weed out those irrelevant factors, like the color of the threads already exists before the cloth is made.
Right. But Śrīharṣa scrutinizes this idea of non-superfluity, specifically the phrase being established, he asks. Does being established independently mean that the cause is brought about independently of the effect, or that we know about it independently?
Ooh, good question. And I'm guessing neither interpretation works out perfectly.
Nope. If it means not brought about independently, then it goes against the whole idea that causes come before their effects. If it means not cognized independently, then we could only ever know about causes through their effects, which we know isn't always true.
It's a tough one. What else could they do?
Some philosophers just gave up on defining cause altogether and said it's a primitive concept, something basic and unanalyzable. Udayana, for example, argued that effects are occasional. They happen at specific times and under specific conditions, not randomly. And he said this occasionality requires a cause to bring the effect about at those specific times.
So he's saying there has to be something that makes the effect happen when and where it does.
Right. But Śrīharṣa had a response for this, too. He invoked something he called the principle of explanation.
Okay, what's that?
He basically said that if you're going to explain a property, the explanation has to come from something that belongs to the same entity. But Udayana was trying to explain the occasionality of the effect by appealing to the causal power of a separate thing, the cause.
So he's saying you can't explain something about A by pointing to something about B.
Right. Plus, he pointed out that if you try to say the cause is also occasional, then you're just pushing the problem back a step. What caused the cause to be occasional? You could end up in an infinite regress, where you need an infinite chain of explanations.
Sounds like a philosophical rabbit hole. Did Śrīharṣa have any other objections?
He did. He also questioned whether occasionality really implies causation in the first place. Is there a necessary connection between those two things? If there isn't, then just because an effect happens at specific times doesn't mean it needs a cause. And if there is a necessary connection, then you have to explain that connection itself, which could lead to yet another regress.
So it seems like no matter how you slice it, defining causation is a major headache.
It is. And this all ties back to Shrana's broader project of showing that reason alone can't give us definitive answers about the nature of reality.
Okay, so we've tackled knowledge and causation. Now let's move on to distinctness. Why was this concept so important to the Naya-Vaishika school?
Well, remember, they were all about a pluralistic view of reality. They believed in lots of separate, independent things, substances, qualities, individual selves, all distinct from each other and from Brahman.
Right, so distinctness was kind of their bread and butter.
Exactly. If they couldn't clearly define what it means for things to be distinct, their whole system would fall apart. Meanwhile, Śrīharṣa, coming from the Upanishadic tradition, believed in non-duality, where ultimately everything is one. So he had to address the obvious question. If everything is one, how can we experience a world full of separate things? His strategy was to examine the concept of distinctness itself and suggest that maybe it's not as straightforward as it seems.
So he's going after the very foundation of their pluralistic worldview.
Precisely. He identified 4 main ways that distinctness could be defined. First, it could be the very nature of each object's svarupa. Second, it could be mutual absence of maitharmya, meaning one thing simply isn't identical to another. Third, it could be a difference in properties by hermia. And fourth, it could be some other special property like separateness, patakva.
Okay, so 4 different options, and I'm guessing Śrīharṣa had problems with all of them.
You guessed it. He argued that each of these definitions leads to the strange conclusion that distinct objects are also, in some sense, non-distinct or even identical. Let's go through them one by one.
Okay, let's start with distinctness being the inherent nature of each object.
Śrīharṣa said that if the distinctness of object X from object Y is part of X's very essence, then X's nature is inherently relational. It's defined by its relationship to Y. But if that's true, then Y becomes part of what makes X what it is. And the same goes for X and Y. They're both defined by their relationship to each other. So how can they be truly distinct if they're so intertwined?
That's a pretty mind-bending argument. What about defining distinctness as mutual absence?
Here, Śrīharṣa cleverly used a principle from Naya-Vaishika itself. They believed that if something is absent, the thing it's absent from has to be real, or at least possible. So if a cloth is distinct from a pot because it lacks the property of being identical to the pot, then that identity, the state of being the same, must be a real possibility for that absence to make sense.
So he's saying that even to define things as distinct, you have to acknowledge a potential connection between them.
Exactly. And that connection undermines their supposed distinctness. Next, there's the idea that distinctness is just a difference in properties.
So a cloth and a pot are distinct because they have different colors, shapes, etc.
Right. But Śrīharṣa argued that if distinctness comes from different properties, then what makes those properties distinct? If you say it's because they have different higher order properties, you end up in an infinite regress.
You'd have to keep explaining distinctness forever.
Exactly. And to avoid that, you'd have to admit that some properties just are distinct without needing further explanation. But that weakens the whole argument that the original objects are distinct because of their
So
properties.
it's a bit of a catch-22.
It is. And finally, there's the idea that distinctness is a separate positive property, like separateness.
So a cloth and a pot each have their own separateness property that makes them distinct.
Right. But Shihara argued that you then have to explain what makes those separateness properties distinct. Do they have different properties themselves? This leads to the same infinite regress problem unless you eventually say that some separateness properties just are distinct without further explanation. But then again, that casts doubt on whether the original cloth and pot are truly distinct.
So he systematically dismantles each of these attempts to define distinctness. It seems like our everyday idea of separateness might be more complicated than we think.
Absolutely. And by questioning both causation and distinctness, Śrīharṣa challenges the very core of the Nyaya Vaisheshika worldview, suggesting that the world might not be as pluralistic as they thought.
So even though he's highly critical of many common-sense ideas about reality, he's very clear about one thing: consciousness is real. This brings us to his positive views on self-knowledge and intentionality.
Yes, Śrīharṣa's skepticism doesn't extend to consciousness itself. For him, consciousness is the fundamental, undeniable reality. The illusion, he thinks, is that we perceive a world of separate, mind-independent objects, when really, it's all just Brahman. To support this view, he offers some interesting perspectives on how we know ourselves and how our minds interact with the world.
Okay, let's start with self-knowledge. I know he's a big proponent of reflexivism. What exactly is that?
Reflexivism is the idea that whenever you have a conscious experience, a thought, a feeling, a perception, that experience is inherently aware of itself. You don't need to have a separate thought about the experience to be aware of it. It's just there, immediately and directly. This is similar to ideas found in some Buddhist traditions.
So it's like you don't have to think, oh, I'm thinking about a cat, to be aware of the thought cat. The awareness is built into the thought itself.
Exactly. And Śrīharṣa's main argument for this is that when we have a conscious experience, we don't usually doubt or question that we're having it. We don't mistakenly think we're having a different experience. This suggests that there's an immediate, inherent awareness built in.
Makes sense. So how does he back this up?
He says that if we needed a separate, higher-order awareness to be aware of our experiences, then it would be possible for us to have an experience without knowing we were having it. And that would open the door to all sorts of doubt and skepticism about our own minds. He thinks the only way to avoid that is to say that consciousness is inherently self-aware.
So he's saying that if you had to have a thought about your thought to be aware of it, you could never be sure if you were really thinking anything at all.
Right. But someone could object to this and say that we have a reliable, though separate, ability to introspect, to look inward at our own minds. They'd say that just because we're usually accurate about our own mental states doesn't mean they're self-aware.
So they're saying maybe there's a special mental tool that lets us access our thoughts and feelings, but those thoughts and feelings themselves aren't inherently aware.
Exactly. And Śrīharṣa had a classic response to this, the regress argument. He said that if every awareness needs another awareness to be aware of it, you'd end up in an infinite chain of awarenesses. Either this chain has no foundation, making everything uncertain, or you eventually have to have an awareness that isn't aware of itself. But if that's the case, you could legitimately doubt whether that final awareness exists, and that would throw doubt on the whole chain.
So it's like saying if you need a light to see a light and another light to see that light and so on, you'd never actually be able to see anything.
Exactly. Śrīharṣa thought this regress problem showed that higher order awareness can't be the basis for self-knowledge. To avoid this, he introduced a principle he called the awareness existence principle.
Okay, what's that all about?
This principle says that if you're not aware of your own awareness of something, you can't be rationally sure that the thing exists. He argues that any reason you might give for believing in the object's existence would ultimately rely on your awareness of it as evidence. But if you're not aware of your own awareness, you have no grounds for believing that your awareness is accurate.
So it's like, if you see a tree, but you're not aware of the fact that you're seeing it, you can't really be sure that the tree is actually there.
Right. And he connects this to the idea of action. Our awareness of the world guides our actions. But if we weren't aware of our own awareness, we couldn't be sure if the world is really as we perceive it, so our actions wouldn't be rationally justified.
Makes sense. If you see a chair and you want to sit down, you need to be aware that you're seeing the chair to be sure it's really there to support you.
Exactly. And if that awareness required another awareness and so on, you'd be in that infinite regress again. So Śrīharṣa concludes that for our actions to be grounded in rational awareness, conscious experience has to include an awareness of itself.
It's a pretty strong argument for the immediacy and certainty of our own experience. But his idea of reflexivism seems to clash with the traditional idea of intentionality, which says that the object